Well, welcome to another episode. Thank you for spending your valuable time with us here today. And it is going to be a very worthwhile conversation, so you will be glad you did. Today, we're going to be talking about an unusual topic. We're talking about negotiating widowhood. And for that conversation, we have three powerhouse women here. We've got Karen Smith Racicot, and Rebecca LaChance. And it is so great to have you ladies here. So welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yes, and for those of you who have not yet heard about them, Rebecca and the two Karens, as they call themselves, are three, as I say, powerhouse women who all sadly lost their spouses in untimely deaths. And instead of giving up, they used their experiences, not to mention their qualifications, including, an MBA, PhD degrees. They used their experiences to help other women facing the challenges of widowhood. And it's no surprise that their book, Widows Among Us, is being heralded as a game changer. So let's jump right in. One of the questions that obviously jumps out at me, when I had the opportunity to meet and you pitched about getting on the podcast, I'm interested to know, how did the three of you meet and how did you come to decide to write this book? And I throw it to you guys. Whoever wants to answer, any combination is great.
I love Morocco. And so I planned a trip to share with other people because I wanted to share the exciting things about it. I had met Karen Smith Racicot through a business meeting or organization we both belonged to, and I had met Rebecca through a mutual friend. They both signed on to come to the trip, Karen with her new husband and Rebecca. And on the last day, we decided to go to a Berber hammam. Would one of you like to explain what happened there?
Well, Berber Hammam is a Moroccan spa. When we were told that, be prepared for anything. And let's just say that afterwards, Rebecca mentioned that we were the only ones to see her tattoo other than her husband. We got to know each other very well in that little tiny, really hot room with no clothes on. So while we were scrubbed and massaged, and it was awesome. But that was, at that time, we knew each other, but not well. But that was kind of a beginning of a bonding for us, just for that experience.
Yeah, beautiful. And so how did it come about to write this book together?
Well, we travel together on occasion, and we happened to be sitting in Sedona on a front porch, wrapped in blankets, in front of a fireplace with glasses of wine, and we were just talking about our experiences, and the idea was we should write a book.
Yeah.
We've had so many experiences that are so different, and we're sure that other widows might have other experiences that they would want to share as well.
Yeah, I love that. And Sedona, oh my gosh, that is a magical place. I totally see how inspiration would have been born there. There is something about that place. And wine, that's always a magic elixir. So great combination. Now, I'm guessing there were negotiations. I mean, it's hard enough writing a book as one person where you've sort of got control of the process. With the three of you sort of collaborating for a project like this, can you tell us, were there any negotiations that you're open to sharing with us?
I think when there's more than one person involved, there is always negotiations and communication, right? The three of us have very different personalities, which will, as you read the stories in the book, you'll see there's different personalities. And so we're talking about a subject that brought all of us at different times to tears. Even, I've been widowed for over 14 years, happily remarried, et cetera, et cetera. I still cry at times, especially around the other two, because it's a shared experience, right? So we learn how to be vulnerable with each other. We learn how to be careful with each other so that if we had differences of opinions, we could voice them without, in a way that still helped us work together, right? Sometimes we took a step back so that we could kind of regroup and approach it differently.
Yeah. I think that's one of the beauties of your book, frankly, is having those three different perspectives. We're so conditioned wrongly, I think, to assume there's like one path for grief, right? You know, it takes this long to get over it, and that's it, be done. And I mean, it is such a unique experience to everyone. And so I think it was brilliant that you guys decided to collaborate on it. Absolutely. So now it's interesting that you said, well, when three people get together, you know, there's always going to be negotiations, because I often say that negotiating our mindset is our first and most important negotiation. So almost every definition of negotiation you see always says two or more people. And I'm like, no, we negotiate with ourselves, you know, thousands of times every day. So I'd love your guys' perspective on what role mindset played in dealing with finding yourself, you know, a widow at your various stages. And tagged onto that, and again, and whoever wants to jump in, what advice do you have for us on negotiating our mindset to show up more powerfully, to be able to still get what we want in life after tragedy hits?
Well, I can speak to mindset during the grieving process, because going through a deep process for myself. I mean, I literally went into an existential crisis, and I literally had to go back to my childhood and look at what happened in my childhood that affected who I was today.
Yeah.
And obviously there are mindset things that happen when you're a child that, you know, get buried in there. And so I had to bring those out. I had to look at them. I had to do a lot of forgiveness, you know, for myself, as well as with my mother and a few other pieces. And so I think mindset plays a very big role, not only in the grieving process and being able to transform oneself into a newer future, but I know that mindset also impacted how my husband died, because he had a childhood fear that continued his entire life with medical professionals, and he never anything about what was wrong with him till it was too late.
Yeah. It's interesting that, you know, I don't like to gender stereotype, but I must say, you find men, I think, much more than women, have this resistance to going to seek medical help. I don't know if it's that invincibility, if it's a vulnerability piece, or what it is. So any tips that any of you can throw that you've experienced on, you know, how we negotiate that mindset to show up more powerfully in the face of tragedy when it hits?
I was going to say, for myself, I literally went back to things that I had done in the past that gave me solace, and that involved art. I did, you know, went back to my artwork. I got deep into my artwork, because when I do art, messages come to help me understand. I use my art to crystallize my thinking, and that's what helped me.
It's amazing how creativity can do that. Because for me, I can't draw, sadly. I wish I could. I love art. The house is just covered in art, but I do write. And my gosh, it's therapeutic. And it's a funny, you know, Rebecca, you mentioned about, you know, childhood traumas and, you know, issues with our mothers, which we all have to a greater or lesser degree. And I wrote a piece one time, and I was just sort of free writing. And then the first, you know, sort of group who'd read it at this event we were at were like, wow, you carry a lot of resentment there. And I'm like, what? I'm like, oh my gosh, I guess I do. That's so interesting. So who else? Karen, I think you were going to jump in on that as well with tips.
Yeah, I was. And what I was going to say, you know, like the mindset piece for me, prior to Sam's death, my husband's death, I was very quiet and shy and kind of like hid in the corners. But we owned a tax and accounting business that I had decided to keep, because you know, we'd run it together for 20 years and, you know, various other reasons. And I knew I had to put myself out there, but I also knew that went against what I was used to. And I very specifically, and again, it's one of those things where when you look back, you can see the progress. You don't necessarily recognize it at the time for what it is. But, you know, I was very, you know, as far as the clothes I wore, fairly conservative, and, you know, it was brown and black and didn't wear a lot of colors. But that summer I got bright green Shrek toenails, right? And a bright red purse, which was totally out of character for me. And I really think that it was like, well, I'm going to look confident. Right. And so maybe I can be confident. I can see that red person, say, okay, that's confidence to me. Right. So it was, you know, maybe not, I think it was kind of a subconscious negotiation with my head. I knew I had to be stronger. I knew I had to be, put myself out there, but I didn't know how. So
Yeah.
that was a step that I could make, and it was okay, right?
Yeah,
So
smart. I think presenting in a new way physically, like through our, accoutrements or whatever, makes us feel differently, has us show up differently, allows us to recreate ourselves subconsciously. It's like we're giving ourselves permission to show up differently. I think that's beautiful. Now, I often say that preparation is key in negotiations. I believe it's equally as important to skills, certainly by a long shot. Can you prepare for a tragic event? And if so, what advice do you have for us in that?
I'm going to address that and check back to the mindset in
Sure.
one second, because my husband was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and it was 3 years later that he passed away.
Yeah.
So there was a mindset where grief started the moment of that diagnosis. And then there was the negotiating with myself about, how much of me I was going to protect versus trying to care for him, how I was going to show my emotions versus trying to make sure I presented as strong to be there for him.
Yeah.
And then as for the preparation, that was the thing that almost immediately came to mind. The first thing was, oh my heavens, yeah, I'm going to lose my husband, and I don't know how much time. And then it's like, okay, now what do we have to do? And I started like making lists in my head and so forth. And gratefully, he had surgery almost 2 weeks late after the diagnosis. And so it was caught early. The treatments helped him survive for another almost 3 years. But in that time, it was preparing both mindset and preparing the paperwork and preparing other people and preparing where we were going to live, where I was going to live. That changed after he died. I moved again, but just lots of details. And we had time to make them and then make mistakes.
Yeah. It's funny. I think most of us are likely to put off this kind of preparation, right? I mean, especially if there's nothing imminent on the horizon, but, we tend to not bother thinking of the worst possible scenario. So I'd love if you guys could share some of the troubles that can arise if we don't, right? If we don't put these preparations in place. I imagine there's a host of problems to deal with, spouses' accounts and credit cards and cell phones and joint accounts. I can't even think of everything.
So, I'll talk about that first. Again, my husband and I, we owned a tax and accounting business. So we were in the financial world. He did investments, et cetera, et cetera. I took care of all the books. I reconciled bank accounts. I did payroll. So I was and am very financially savvy.
Yeah.
But I never wanted to talk about the what if conversations, right?
Yeah.
What if something happens? And I knew that if something happened to me, Sam would be fine because he could find someone else to replace me. I was not an accountant. I was an office manager, basically. I ran the business, but whatever, how important is that, right?
Yeah,
Which
pretty important,
was,
but I hear
but,
you.
I was like, well, it's not that big of a deal. Anybody can do it. But I never wanted to think about life without Sam. So I refused to have those conversations with him as to what if. And unfortunately, my dad had passed away just 6 months prior to Sam, and my dad had worked for us. So we were going through that with my mom, who, again, they hadn't prepared, that very little life insurance, what happens when the income gets cut, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm trying to help her through that. And, and I said to Sam, we need to talk about this. And he'd be like, okay, well, here's what it is. And I'd be like, you know what? I don't want to hear it. I don't want to talk about it because I don't want to ever think it's going to happen.
Yeah.
So when it did, it was hard.
Yeah.
It was really hard because we didn't have in place what we needed to. And that's one of the conversations that I have a lot of now is it's not an easy conversation, but you are doing yourself and your family such a favor when you have those conversations.
Yeah. Beautiful. So important. And do you guys have like either in the book or do you have like a little checklist for people of things that they should start preparing for?
Yes, we do.
Yes.
It's not exactly in the book because the book is trade size, it's 6x9. And so people will be able to download it through our website.
Yeah, that's smart actually as a resource. And we'll make sure to put that in the show notes as well so that people can access that. I think that'd be a super helpful lead magnet for you guys as well to get people to be thinking about it and more likely to pick up the book. Now, when faced with the loss of a partner, do you guys think like Is there a time period that you would suggest you should wait, if at all, before making major decisions? What are your thoughts on that?
I'm primarily the person who goes against the social constructs. And, and the advice has always been that a widow should wait for 1 year before she makes a major decision, like selling her house or selling a business. And that is not the situation for so many widows. Because they haven't prepared, or they found out they're missing money, or they can't they have to make the decision to sell my house now, or maybe sell my business now. It really is a decision that has to be based on each widow's own situation.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, because there's no one cookie cutter response for any. We're all unique individuals. It's our psychological makeup, our economic circumstances, our, a whole host, our cultural backgrounds. There's a whole host of factors that come into play. Now, the issue of family has come up a couple of times so far. So what are some of the difficult conversations that arise, for widows in particular, in dealing with family, and any tips on how you negotiate those sort of relationships and issues?
We have family who step in and tell a widow what she should do. And that's one of the major cautions we make, is that help and support and patience and tolerance. Women have to make the decision themselves, and as well as widowers have to make the decisions themselves about when, who, what they're going to do. And we've talked to so many widows in some of our just formal interviews or conversations, with horrific stories about what family members have said or insisted.
Yeah. Yeah. And I bet one of those is about the path of dating, potentially. Am I right? And, and if so, what is the verdict? Do you guys have a consensus on how, like, negotiating the path of dating as a widow? Any tips or insights on that?
Well, I think the two Karens should address that primarily.
Rebecca's not dating yet. Both Karen and I kind of jumped into it in a way. I had known that my husband was going to be passing away, and you start grieving and start preparing. I'm a planner too. We have all those type styles, and I happen to be one who plans. So within a year of my husband's passing, I signed on to social media, and at Match.com, I met a gentleman who I've just celebrated having known and been with for 6 years.
Oh, congrats.
Yeah.
Goodness.
So interestingly enough, I actually threw myself into the dating pool a little after a year after Sam had died.
Yeah.
And a part of that, my first inclination was, oh, I'm single. I'm gonna, meet a bunch of guys and date a bunch of people and blah, blah, blah. My girls were in college, or, whatever. But honestly, I was like, you know what? I loved being married. I loved having a companion, and that's what interested me. And so I met Bob a year after Sam died. We got married a year after that, partly because my one daughter was leaving for the Peace Corps for 2.5 years, and they didn't want to get married while she was gone. But also my mindset was, and kind of still is right today, is life is short. Why wait?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, I wanted to experience life with Bob. We met, we had an instant connection. I wanted to experience life with him.
Yeah.
But when I first started dating him, I didn't tell anybody, because I didn't want anybody to know. Because my thought was, they're going to be like, oh my gosh, Sam's only been gone for a year. How could she start dating someone? She must not have loved him that much, right? This is my head telling me, right?
Yeah.
Whereas when people found out, they were thrilled.
Oh,
they were
good.
thrilled. So, that expectation of what you think others are going to think is often not true.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oftentimes is, but
Sometimes it is, yeah.
Well, it's funny, because I was thinking there's
critics.
both, right?
Yeah, there's going to be the critic, but not everybody is a critic. So
Yeah. Although people do love to judge today. I mean, especially with the anonymity of social media, it's like, oh my goodness. So, but I think regardless, I often talk, when we talk about negotiating our mindset, and I'm having this discussion with one of my boys recently all the time. You need to get your satisfaction. You need to get your validation, your sense of self, your confidence, all needs to come internally. Don't ever be dependent on external feedback on that, right? I mean, you need to just have unshakable self-love, And then it doesn't matter what all the naysayers are saying. You can take that feedback and filter it. And if something resonates, great. But if it doesn't, don't let it affect your sort of judgment or sense. Now, we had talked a minute ago, and it's kind of came up in the conversation organically about, whether it's socioeconomic status or, gender, all of these different sort of factors, culture, et cetera. What are some of the, generational conditioning, if you will, or economic problems that widows face, and how do you negotiate past some of those hurdles? Do you guys address that?
Yes, we do. And one of the things that we found was that mothers and grandmothers who had been widowed 25, 40 years never shared that experience with their daughters.
Yeah.
So, it's like, well, what happened? You woke up one day and you were a widow. What else happened? And nobody knew. Nobody talked about it. Nobody knew that, it was okay not to grieve like Joanne down the street, or it's okay to get a new husband, at some point in time. And we literally have decided, and there is a section of the book that we refer to, mamas, teach your daughters how to be widows.
Oh, nice. Oh, wow. Powerful.
Yeah, because there are just so many young women who are becoming widows also.
Yeah.
And if a horror story is one young woman in her mid-30s, her husband died, she had 3 young kids, she was a stay-at-home mom, she lost all of her income, she had no health care insurance, they had no life insurance, she had nothing.
Yeah.
And if there had been some way for an older generation to pass that information to her, she could have started to be prepared for herself. This really is 7 out of 10 women will be widows by the time they're 70 years old.
Wow.
The average age for a widow in the United States is 59.
I did not know that. Yeah.
I was 47.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And 2,800 women in America, in the United States, become widowed every day. 2,800 a day.
That's pretty staggering numbers. And again, it's one thing when you talk about that generation sort of passing it on. I think it's one of the things that makes your book so powerful is that for those who haven't had that experience as someone sharing, your book is the stand-in for that, which I think is lovely, right? So
I jokingly say it should be a wedding present.
Yeah. Yeah, I could see the puzzled faces.
Open after the honeymoon though, right?
That's funny, actually. That should be one of your marketing pitches on this, right? The book that you should buy as a wedding gift, given the stats today. That's interesting. Now, for any of our listeners who may be dealing with a loved one or someone in their life, not themselves, but somebody who they care about who's recently widowed, do you have any insights for how to negotiate that relationship? Any advice for our listeners who are in this? Because I've heard you all give variations of, people doing sort of with the best intentions, sort of the wrong thing or things that were not helpful or counterproductive. So what advice do you have for listeners out there, and what are some of the to-dos and don'ts?
One of the first don'ts is do not say, call me when you need me or if you need something, because honestly, we're lucky we can get out of bed in the morning, right? Not picking up that phone and calling, thinking about what you need and then making the effort to call someone. It's just not going to happen. So that's one of the don'ts. Just be there. Pick up the phone and call them and say, hey, thinking about you. You don't have to know what to say. Nobody knows what to say. One of the biggest things you can do for a friend or family member that has lost someone is just let them know that you care and you're thinking about them.
Check in on them every now and then. And I was just talking it's amazing how many widow stories we hear when people know what we're doing. And I was talking to a bartender on Monday night while I was waiting to get a restaurant coupon for something I'm working on. And she said that one of her friends in her 30s had just lost her husband. And she says she's a very strong woman. That's what many people think of other widows. Oh, she's strong. She's doing really well. Sometimes it's on the surface. And and so one of my suggestions to her was, if she doesn't want to talk about it or she's not really willing to talk, we always say, invite somebody over and say, sunrise tomorrow is going to be gorgeous. Come join me for a cup of coffee. The evening is gorgeous. The river out front is running or whatever. The sunset is going to be super. Come over for a glass of wine. And just sit there and observe. You don't have to ask questions. You don't have to say anything. Let her talk if she wants to talk without. And then many widows love to hear people talk about their husbands to reassure them that they were loved by more people than just them. They don't want you to stop talking about their husband just because
Yeah.
it might hurt their feelings or pull out some pain.
Yeah. Wow. Great advice, all of you. That was fabulous. And as you were saying that, I was thinking last night, we just had spectacular stars and I just laid out on the back deck staring up, and what a safe space that would be to be with somebody. You don't even have to be looking in the eyes. They could be lying down beside you, both looking up, and just the space to talk or choose not to talk. I think that's lovely. Now, for each of you, what is one of the most sort of surprising things that you discovered while writing the book? We talked about how that creative can sometimes unearth things we weren't even aware of. Did any of you have that experience while writing the book?
I was surprised sometimes how triggered or emotional I would get about stuff that I thought I was over. You know what I'm saying? And I don't mean necessarily Sam's death, right? But there were other things, like I've lost some friends because they weren't there for me and I didn't have the energy to keep them, and they've fallen away, and it's hurtful, right? It hurts, but it's a reality.
Yeah.
And so sometimes I was surprised at that I was still that emotional about some things.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. I can totally appreciate that. And how about you, Rebecca? Or Karen, the other Karen?
Was surprised as we were writing this, I would just want to backtrack a minute and say, how when you've been told that your first draft is always throwawayable. And for me, it was like the first draft was just the facts, just the facts. And it took 4 or 5 drafts before I was willing to let the hard stuff come out.
Yeah.
And what was so surprising to me when I let the hard stuff come out was never in a million years would I have described myself experiencing the depth of grief that I did. I didn't think I had that in me.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting when you say about that, it wasn't until the 5th. And I hadn't thought about it in years. A long time ago, I was doing a workshop and they had groups coming together, and we had to brainstorm. So they'd have us write our ideas as a group, and put them. And then he said, okay, he said, write down 5 ideas, brainstorm, go now. And everybody's brainstorming, coming up with these ideas on the problem. And then he said, okay, now I want you to take those 5 ideas and throw them out because they're crap. They're the superficial stuff that aren't getting to it. Now I want you to go back to the table again and come up with some more ideas. And sure enough, those ideas were deeper and resonated more creative. It was a really interesting exercise. Now, and Karen, I don't know if you wanted to weigh in, Karen Justice?
Well, I think that part of my realization and the insight that I got was how we've all talked about who we were. In the book, we all talk about who we were and how that's influenced who we are now and how we experienced the widowhood experience. There was air quotes there for your listeners. and I think it was very insightful to me to go back and identify the fact that so much of my past prepared me for the way in which I experienced being widowed. But then again, also, as Karen said, as we were writing the book, we don't all live in the same place. So sometimes we'd meet someplace and write together. And that's when the tears really flowed, because when we're all there experiencing and talking about the same thing at the same time. But they pulled things out of me I really, kind of had swallowed or didn't want to share. And I go, Karen. So, they were negotiating.
Yes, it is. Absolutely.
They negotiated it right out of me with ice cream.
Ice cream involved in that negotiation too.
That always helps. The best kind of negotiation. Absolutely.
There's always a way to my stomach and my mind.
And I'm just curious, since we're talking specifically about negotiation, What was your experience in having to negotiate some of those practical things like the bank accounts and or, dealing with real estate or whatever? Any stories, quick stories to share about that?
Well, and I was just trying to decide if that was really a cell phone. We had time to prepare for the bank accounts and the investment accounts and so forth. One thing I do remember was good advice, not so much a negotiation, from my investment advisor, who told me to take money out early while he was changing the names on the accounts, so that if I needed it, I would have it.
Yeah.
But then John and I had shared all of his passwords we could think of, including the Verizon account,
Yeah.
except he didn't give me the password for the phone. Never thought about that.
Yeah.
So when I tried to close the account, they wanted to text me a code so that I could prove that I was authorized or whatever. And I couldn't open his phone to get the texting. So I had to, the negotiation of, okay, now this is the situation. What can I do about it? And it took me 2 or 3 months, because I was in the midst of other things too. And then I discovered that he had a hotspot something or other on his account, and they didn't bother to close that at the same time. So I had to negotiate getting my money back, closing that and getting my money back from that.
Yeah.
And you don't need that when you're sad.
Yeah. 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 And it's interesting. We were talking earlier about before we went online here about tech. In some ways, everybody assumes it makes things easier, but there are many, many ways that it actually makes the process more challenging to sort of navigate, I find, right? So many more levels of bureaucracy. Way back in the day, you had a personal relationship with the bank managers or all these accountants, and now everything is multinational, global, no sort of FaceTime. And I imagine that makes it much more challenging. And what role, if any, would you say that emotion played in the negotiations? Whether, we've heard a bit about the tears and that, but also dealing with some of the formal, from the personal to the professional, call it that way. What role would you say emotion played?
Well, I was angry with Verizon.
Yeah. Yes.
I'll let the other two answer the other.
Well, I will say that the emotion played for me when my husband was diagnosed with his illness, and because he refused to ask the questions that he needed to have, I was the one who had to do all the really deep digging and forcing the questions, and I just got so angry for such a long period of time that my blood pressure went up.
Yeah.
And I had to start medication to bring my blood down. It was just stunning to me about, how people didn't want to give information.
Yeah.
Well, and I think, one of the things for me, and it kind of goes hand in hand with my, my journey through the self-confidence after Sam's death, but it's like, I had to get things done, right? Like it was either crawl back into my hole in my comfort zone or move forward. And so like once I knew I was going to move forward, there was nothing that was going to stand in my way. And so, that was some of the new emotions to me of I can do this.
Yeah.
I whether I want to or not, this is the path I've chosen and I have to do it. And so that, I would then come home and cry or cry in the shower or, whatever. But I was like, I have to be strong because I personally cannot break down, because then I'm going to lose my footing. Right. And so, that was a little bit too, as as a business owner with employees, and I felt like they were looking to me. Sam's gone now, Karen's the leader, and I felt like I had to be strong for them. But and that's kind of a little bit of an oxymoron too, in the sense of, I'm just finding my footing, but I knew people were relying on me. So
Well, it's funny. We are so conditioned when we think of negotiation, again, whether personally or professionally, leave emotion out of it, leave emotion out of it. But in some ways, leaning into the messiness, having that vulnerability can really help, because there has to be an outlet for it. Like you say, whether for you, it's go in the shower and do it, whatever, but when we pretend they're not there, it shows up in other ways. We get triggered in other ways, and then it impacts negatively on our ability to get things done, to get those best outcomes. So Well, this has been a fabulous conversation. Definitely one we need more time for. So we'll have to do a follow-up later when you hit your first million sales of the book or whatever. But I normally like to end by asking, what's one of the greatest mindset shifts that you've had in your life? It doesn't have to be about this issue at all. Just I love sharing. I had some really interesting answers. And sometimes it's the simplest things that make you go, oh, I can see why that's a total aha moment that has you show up differently or feel differently.
So for me, it has to do with the fact that how I think about something and my attitude towards it totally is how it's going to be,
Yes.
right? It's a very firm believer in the law of attraction and the universe. And, I can follow that path now, knowing that, when I'm thinking a certain way, that's what happens. So you gotta, mind your P's and Q's in your mind,
Oh, so powerful, Karen. And I'm laughing, not at you. I'm laughing because I am constantly ragging at my kids because I didn't recognize this until much later in life. And
Yep.
I'm constantly saying to them, your reality is determined by your thoughts and the meaning you attach to them. So choose more positive meanings. That's beautiful. Okay, Karen Justice, how about you?
I'm digging here, and I really can't find it. I think the most surprising thing about my mindset or change in attitude, and maybe you can say desires in some way, since being widowed, as I said, I've been with, I have a life partner that I'm dearly in love with, but don't want to get married, don't want to live together. And I'm one of those extroverts who loves bouncing ideas off of somebody and loves being with people, but I like living by myself.
Nice.
And I mean, there are times when, I don't eat right because cooking for one is not fun. And, there are downsides to it too. But I think that's the biggest surprise to me, is that I've chosen solitude for a lifestyle rather, well, not solitude exactly, but I've chosen living alone, and that surprised me.
Yeah. Well, not just a surprise. I think that is a mindset shift, right? Like, hey, this is okay. Having space is an okay choice to make, right? Because we are so pressured to couple up and, mate like penguins for life. So I love that. And Rebecca, how about you?
I think one of the biggest mindset that occurred for me many, many years ago was about the power of nature.
Yes.
And when I moved after my husband died and moved into this new house, I mean, somebody was looking out for me because my house is right up against a wood. I have rabbits and deer and, all kinds of wild critters that live around me. And it's rejuvenating and fulfilling to stand on my deck and breathe in that fresh air and to watch the critters play.
Oh, I love that you brought that up. And it's funny when you think about it, back in the 60s or whatever, you look back to, so-called hippies and everything. And my gosh, now it's so funny, all of these many, many decades later, and it turns out they were right. The science is now catching up to support, all of the biggest insult, calling somebody a tree hugger. Well, guess what? Physically hugging a tree actually has scientific medical benefits. So who knew?
Absolutely.
Well, thank you all so much for sharing your journey with us and sharing your experiences with us. And where can people learn more about you? Where should we be directing them in the show notes?
They can visit our website, www.threewidows.com.
I love that.
And the book is available on Amazon, so you can look it up under Widows Among Us.
Beautiful.
So
I love that title, by the way. You guys did a bang up job on that. And also, I always encourage, I'm a big fan of independent bookstores. So absolutely, Amazon is a choice. And don't be afraid to ask your local bookstore to get it in as well, which I think is a big help.
We plan on hitting up as many as we can to get it out there too.
Yeah. Well, I'm saying to our listeners, though, don't be afraid to ask your local bookstore to get the book in for you as well. It's a great way to get more visibility for the book. And then things have a beautiful ripple effect. And this is an important subject. So thank you to each of you for sharing here today. It's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you very much. We've enjoyed it.
Thank
It's
you.
been wonderful.
Yeah, and for our listeners, I have no doubt that you got a lot of heartfelt value from this episode. I know I certainly did. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't done that yet to this podcast, and also give the gift of sharing. Share this episode with people in your life who you know could benefit, certainly to any widowers in your life or to some, frankly, to everybody, because for people, we all deal with somebody who's suffering loss at some point in our life, and this helps you at both ends of that spectrum. And before we sign off today, just wanted to share some ways we can work together if you're looking to up-level your negotiation skills. And by that, I don't mean just business, because all of life is a negotiation. I've got everything from online to group to my signature one-on-one mastermind and VIP experiences to help you leverage your innate power to get more of what you want and deserve in life across the spectrum. And if that sounds interesting, check it out at artoffemininenegotiation.com, and make sure to grab a copy of my book of the same name if you haven't already had a chance to read it, Art of Feminine Negotiation, How to Get What You Want from the Boardroom to the Bedroom. And that is a wrap for this episode. So until next time, go forth and negotiate your best life on your terms so you can stop missing out and start getting more of what you want and deserve from the boardroom to the bedroom. Until next time, take care.